Good evening, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started. If you haven't gotten a copy of the book outside, please do so. First of all, welcome to the Open Society Foundations in New York City. It's our pleasure to host you this evening for what promises to be a terrific event for the boldly titled new book, The End of White Christian America, by our friend Robert Jones. I'm Bill Vandenberg, a member of the Open Society Foundation Senior Leadership for United States-based strategies and grant-making, and it's my honor to introduce tonight's event. I grew up in the whitest state in the United States, the beautiful state of Maine, and grew up in the United Church of Christ, so this conversation hits close to home for me personally and professionally. I'd first like to thank Robert Jones, whom I've known as Robbie for several years now, and Sam Tannenhouse for joining us here for the conversation tonight. I'd also like to thank Elizabeth Guernsey, Nathan McKee, and the Open Society Foundation's events team for putting the event together. In addition to the Open Society Foundations, tonight's event is generously co-sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Ford Foundation, the Henry Luce Foundation, and the New World Foundation. Thanks to all. First things first, I'm a longtime fan of Robert Jones and his organization, PRRI, formerly known as the Public Religion Research Institute, and found at prri.org. PRRI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that's dedicated to conducting high-quality public opinion research. Its research explores and illuminates America's changing cultural, religious, and political landscape. And its stated mission is to help journalists, scholars, pundits, thought leaders, clergy, and the general public better understand debates on public policy issues and the important cultural and religious dynamics that shape American society and politics. PRRI's annual American Values Survey is a must-read for anyone who wants to better understand how Americans from across the political spectrum interpret and develop their opinions on the debates of the day. This essential work helps us to better understand this complicated, messy, polarized, and contested nation in which we live. And we are, of course, a nation that contains amazing diversity, people, communities, and many possibilities to truly be exceptional and to transcend all that divides us or that holds up forward progress. But we often don't live up to our ideals, and our deeds do not always follow our creeds. So The End of White Christian America could, to some, sound like a book that would be written by an author who sees demographic shifts in the United States in near-apocalyptic framing. We know that Robert's work places this much more thoughtfully within a broader context that is acutely sensitive to race and racial justice. And here at the Open Society Foundations, we have long been interested in the complex conundrum of advancing racial justice and confronting structural inequalities in the United States. The time in which we live now is, of course, one of great possibility, with the continued rise of diversity in every possible way and vibrant social movements that could lead to a truly multiracial and more just society. And yet, as we very much know, it's also a time of great turbulence, as evidenced by xenophobia and race baiting in the election, continued scapegoating of Muslims and immigrants for political gain, and killings of unarmed Black men and women, to name a few challenges. We have worked in the past with Robert Jones and PRRI to explore how white people see race in the United States, what their thoughts are about structural inequality, and whether they see growing diversity as a thing of beauty and an asset, or a reflection of decline and a threat. So let me now introduce tonight's guests. Robert P. Jones is the founding CEO of PRRI and a leading scholar and commentator on religion and politics. He's the author of The End of White Christian America, which we know very well this evening, 2 other books, and numerous peer review articles on religion and public policy. Jones writes a column for The Atlantic Online on politics and culture and appears regularly on Interfaith Voices, the nation's leading religion news magazine on public radio. He is frequently featured in major national media such as MSNBC, CNN, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. And Dr. Jones serves as the co-chair of the National Steering Committee for the Religion and Politics section at the American Academy of Religion and is a member of the editorial boards for the Journal of the American Academy of Religion and for Politics and Religion, a journal of the American Political Science Association. Robert holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and a Master's of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Our second guest is Sam Tannenhouse, and he is the former editor-in-chief of the New York Times Book Review. He's also the author of The Death of Conservatism and Whittaker Chambers, A Biography, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was a finalist for both the National Book Award for Nonfiction and the Pulitzer Prize for Biography. Tannenhouse is currently working on a biography of William F. Buckley, Jr., and Sam recently, on June 20th, as you know from the copies outside on the table, published a review of this season's political books for the New York Times Book Review, where he noted the end of white Christian America was, in quotes, quite possibly the most illuminating text for this election year. So we'll now hear main findings from the end of white Christian America from its author. We'll have a response from Sam, and then a conversation between the two of them. And then around 5:45 p.m. or so, we'll have an open question and answer session that will be facilitated by my friend Simon Greer, who's here in the audience. At 6:30, we'll wrap the formal event, and there'll be a book signing and additional books for sale for your friends and family outside this room. So without further ado, thanks to all for joining us. And Robbie, Sam, please take it away.
I go up now. Or do I wait? You can go up after
Thank you so much. I'll make sure I'm on here. Thank you so much for all being here. When many of you might be tuning in to the Democratic National Convention as we speak, but happy that you're here instead, joining us for this conversation. I do want to just say my own thank yous to the co-hosts, particularly the Open Society Foundations here for hosting us tonight, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Ford Foundation, the Henry Luce Foundation, and the New World Foundation. Many of these foundations have supported the work that went into the book here. Also, you'll hear a little bit later from Simon Greer. He is a PRI board member and also helped us organize the event tonight, so I'm indebted to him as well. And then, of course, Sam Tannenhouse, with whom I'll be speaking in a bit, who wrote this fantastic essay, Why Populism Now?, which has been, of course, one of the burning questions of this election cycle. So Bill's kind of giving you an idea of the overview of kind of what we're going to do this evening. I want to spend just a few minutes, though, giving you a little bit of the taste of the data behind the book. Now, I do want to say that this is a data-driven book, but it's not a data-dominated book. So for those of you whose eyes glaze over at statistics, I think hopefully it tells a story that I think uses numbers to tell a story. So I'm going to we'll do a little bit more of the storytelling as we're talking together, but I do want to kind of lay out some of the kind of empirical basis for the argument and the story that I tell in the book. And I'm going to start actually with this picture here. You can probably see it a little more clearly on the sides, but so this picture may evoke some other kinds of imagery for some of you. It looks remarkably like Norman Rockwell's Freedom from Want painting, right? Which has this kind of, in that photo, the only difference is you've got the kind of matriarch leaning over with this enormous turkey, right, in the thing. So I got this photo was sent to me in an email in 2012, just weeks after, actually days after President Barack Obama was reelected in 2012. It was at the top of an email from the Christian Coalition of America. And I was struck by it at the time because it came like really right on the heels. It was in between the election and Thanksgiving. And it had this caption underneath it. It said, Family at Prayer, Pennsylvania, 1942. Right, is the image here. Of course, it's a black and white photo. It's a white family saying grace before a meal. And then it had this line of text further explaining kind of the transition from the photo to the message of the Christian Coalition of America. It said this, excuse me. It said, we will soon be celebrating the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving, and God has still not withheld his blessings upon this nation, although we now richly deserve such condemnation. We have a lot to give thanks for, but we also need to pray to our Heavenly Father and ask him to protect us from those enemies outside and within who want to see America destroyed. All right, so that's the message that comes from, attached to this image right after the re-election of President Barack Obama in 2012. And, at the time I wasn't really working on the book quite yet, but I immediately saved it because it seemed to me a kind of artifact and a symbol of kind of this visceral reaction to the re-election of Barack Obama in 2012. And so part of the book is about unpacking, like, what is that about when we see these kind of reactions and this kind of throwback imagery, right, to a kind of previous time, a kind of mythical golden era, what's behind that sense of nostalgia and loss and grief. And so the book is called, The End of White Christian America. And I want to say to kind of prevent some confusion, what I mean by white Christian America really is a metaphor for the whole cultural institutional edifice that was built not exclusively but primarily by white Protestant Christians in this country that really did set the tone for our national conversations and really shaped a lot of American ideals. I mean, it wouldn't be hard, many of you may have walked here, to walk very far without tripping over an institution that was started by white Christian America, white Protestants. So the YMCA, the YWCA, the Boy Scouts, it would not be hard to kind of find these things. And yet, these kinds of institutions in the world that they were really a part of has really passed from the American scene. So that's really what the book is about. And you can see this in a number of demographic ways. You can see it in architecture. I'm going to focus a little bit on the demographics just for the setup of the conversation here. If I could show you just one chart, unfortunately, I'm going to show you a few more. But if I could show you just one chart, it would be this one. That really shows us some real changes that happened just over the last 8 years. So I've got shaded in kind of this light gray the period of Barack Obama's presidency. This is all white Christians together, the percentage that all white Christians, Protestants, Catholics, non-denominational, Orthodox, all lumped together comprise of the American population. So in 2004, 59% of the country. By 2008, when President Barack Obama was running for president just 2 election cycles ago, that number was 54%. Today, that number is 45%. It was 47% in 2014, and just in the next year, our latest data shows it at 45%. So just during the last 2 election cycles, during President Barack Obama's presidency, we have crossed this amazing threshold. We have moved from being a majority white Christian country to a minority white Christian country in just a short amount of time. So this is, in fact, even if people, I think, don't know these stats that well, I think many white Christians, particularly white conservative Christians, feel this shift in their bones, right? And this is part of some of the reactivity that we're seeing. Just to kind of put one more kind of symbolic issue across this same time period, I'm putting up here support for gay marriage over this same period of time. And right, so if you just, again, go back to 2008, what you see is that only about 4 in 10 Americans supported gay marriage when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008. That number today is 53%. So similarly, we've gone from a country where only about 4 in 10 supported same-sex marriage to being a country where a majority support same-sex marriage. That's a major cultural shift on a pretty big bellwether issue in a short amount of time. So, so part of what the story that the book is telling is really about unpacking the reactions and the grief and the anxiety around the reactions to these kinds of demographic and cultural change that we've seen really in the last decade of our nation's life. So just to kind of give you a little pie chart here of the kind of country that we live in, this is 2014 data. So 47% of the country, white Christian. The other big piece of this story, though, is this big orange slice here, the religiously unaffiliated in the country, right? So part of how we got here was two basic forces. One was demographics, so immigration patterns, lower birth rates among whites. Those things affected the kind of white population relative to the rest of the country. But the other piece that's more internal to the Christian world was religious disaffiliation, particularly among young people over the last few decades. So if we go back just a few decades to the 1990s, only about less than 1 in 10 Americans claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. Today, again, that number is nearly a quarter of Americans claim no religious affiliation at all, and it's disproportionately affecting the young. So as you can see in this slide. So this is, if you kind of think about this slide as a little bit of an archaeological dig down through generational strata as one way of kind of reading this chart, right? So if you look at 18 to 29-year-olds at the top here, only 29% of them identify as white and Christian. But compare that to seniors down here at the bottom. 2/3 of seniors identify as white and Christian. That is a huge shift just in the generations that are alive today. And that is part of the seismic changes that we're seeing. Here's the other numbers. And again, the bookend to this are the numbers of Americans who are claiming no religious affiliation. You can see seniors, only about 1 in 10 claiming no religious affiliation. But among the youngest, the millennial generation, more than 1/3 claiming no religious affiliation. Again, a big sea change in a short amount of time. So just to kind of look a little bit behind this a bit. So what does this look like in a little bit of a longer scope? This is just looking at percent of population by race and by religious affiliation here, with just looking at Protestants. So if you look here, you'll see that up until 1993, we were still a majority white and Protestant country. That little blip there in the middle that begins to slide after 1993, that's the last year the country was white and Protestant. And you can basically, the decline of Protestants, though, is in the country is really entirely due to white Protestant decline. So this green area here are African American Protestants, which have maintained their share of the population over time. And you'll see that these kind of orange tones are Latino, Asian Pacific Islander Protestants that are actually growing. All right, so it really is white, non-Hispanic Protestants that have contributed to the decline almost exclusively over this time period. Now, part of the mythology around kind of white Protestant decline has been that the mainline Protestant denominations, that is the more liberal and the Episcopalians, United Church of Christ that Bill is a member of, that those denominations have been declining, and their decline actually started a little bit earlier, started in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. That has been the major story of kind of white Protestant decline. And, if you plot it, you can see it, right? It's actually there. That is true. What's new on the scene, though, is that the other kind of branch of the Protestant family tree, the white Protestant family tree, white evangelical Protestants, have actually begun to decline just over the last decade as well. So we now have measurable decline among white evangelical Protestants as well as white mainline Protestants. And that means that the white evangelicals in the South can no longer kind of point their fingers at their Northeastern cousins, right, and say, you guys are declining for all your liberal theology and we're kind of holding the line, and we're growing. So that's not what we see at this point. In fact, we see decline on both sides. These are the external numbers at the national level. You can also see it if you look inside of the kind of major evangelical denominations themselves. The largest evangelical denomination are Southern Baptists. This is a plot of growth rates among Southern Baptists from the 1950s to the present. Right, so you can see kind of still in growth mode really until the last decade, and just in the last decade have slipped into kind of negative growth rates, losing members. They've posted basically 9 straight years of demographic loss over time. So what does this mean for the electorate? And we're all kind of in the middle of two national parties having their conventions, and we're kind of headed toward we'll get a little bit of break for August, right? But then it will rev up in earnest after Labor Day, and it will be nothing but all election all the time. So what does this mean for the election cycle? One of the striking things is that you can actually see the exact same patterns in the electorate, right? So this is data from the national exit polls. And you can see if you go back to 1992, general elections, white Christians made up nearly 3/4 of the electorate. 2012, that was down to 57%. And if you project that linear decline out, if all these trends continue, 2024 will be the first year that we have a majority or an electorate that is majority non-white Christian in the electorate. Interestingly, though, what happens if you fill in the midterm votes, what you see is you basically get a holdover effect every midterm election, mostly because white Christians tend to turn out at higher rates in midterm elections than non-white Christians and unaffiliated Americans do as well. So you kind of see the stair-stepping effect where you get a holdover from the midterm, basically where you were the last year, and then you see a drop off with the next presidential election year up there. So you say the same pattern, just basically delayed a bit because of the higher turnout rates of white Christians in the electorate. But one other way of looking at this is to kind of ask the question, so how reliant have the two political parties been on white Christian voters over time, and what might that mean for the coming election cycles? So in this chart, basically what it is, this is the reliance among Democratic presidential candidates on white Christian voters over time. So in 1992, Democratic presidential candidate Bill Clinton, 60% reliant on white Christian voters for his coalition. But if you look at where Barack Obama was in 2012, only 37% reliant on white Christian voters over time. So basically the Democratic Party has been following this decline in the population over time and with less and less reliance on white Christian voters. But check out the Republican line. It looks pretty flat. right? About 8 in 10 Republican candidates, both in the 90s and today, relying on white Christian voters for their coalition. And one interesting thing I did for the last elections, kind of put up this chart where I kind of looked back at the again, these kind of generational strata, and then I plotted Obama's coalition and Romney's coalition kind of into this generational strata. And basically what it tells you, if you kind of look at the kind of racial and religious composition of their coalitions, that the Obama coalition looked about like 30-year-old America, right, in terms of its kind of racial and religious upbringing. The Romney coalition looked about like 70-year-old America in terms of its race and religious composition. So this tells you like some of the challenges and why, for example, the Republican Party in its own kind of autopsy report, right, in 2013, made this plea to kind of be widen the tent, appeal to kind of a broader voter base, because essentially they're remaining as reliant on this shrinking demographic and this shrinking voter pool as they have been in decades past. So the one thing I'll close with, and then Sam and I will come up here and have a conversation, is just this chart, which I think will make a nice transition into maybe talking about what does this mean for the contemporary scene. One of the more interesting survey questions that we have asked at PRRI is this kind of basic question about how do you evaluate the 1950s, right? So if you think back to that black and white photo at the beginning of the presentation, does that evoke kind of warm and fuzzy feelings for you, or does that evoke kind of very negative and kind of worrisome feelings for you? And it turns out that the country is evenly divided pretty much on this question about whether American culture and way of life has changed for the better or whether it's changed for the worst since the 1950s. So here's the basic kind of breakdown, right? All Americans here saying, nearly half saying it's changed for the better, but you can kind of see a pattern emerging here. So if you look over here on the left, it's religiously unaffiliated, African Americans, Democrats, Latino Catholics, African American Protestants, Hispanics overall, saying that American culture and way of life has changed for the better since the 1950s. On the other side of the divide, right, are really, if you kind of look in places that are getting significantly different from all Americans, it really is Republicans, Tea Party, and white evangelical Protestants way over there on the left. 7 in 10 white evangelical Protestants saying that American culture has changed for the worst since the 1950s. So I think, and here's the other side of that, just so you can kind of see it stacked up. And I think this, in many ways, is one of the dividing lines in the election that we're facing today. Two very different visions of America, two very different evaluations of a kind of waspy a cultural center that held sway in the 1950s, and then where are we going today? So with that, I will bring up Sam, and we'll have a conversation.
Well, there's a lot to admire about Robbie Jones, but first of all, that he can actually pull off wearing a suit on a day as hot as today. So congratulations for making me look bad, but you're not the first who's done that.
But no time.
Right. First of all, I just have to say, as somebody who's written books and edited a book review and writes a lot about many different books, that I have to say this is one you really want to read. And because in the most surreal of elections, it makes sense that the book that would illuminate it best isn't really just about politics. Because this isn't an election that's just about politics, or we wouldn't be at the place we are just now. It's about a kind of cultural protest. It's about America being divided against itself in just the way Robbie's talked about. So what I want to do is just pick up on a few things you said, Robbie, and just have you illuminate them a little bit. First of all, I'll ask the audience to do just a bit of a thought experiment that I came up with a number of years ago. If you remember, a big figure in our politics, our culture, was Glenn Beck. Remember him? In 2009 and 2010, he was one of the most visible and vocal people in America. He's on the cover of Time magazine, and he had his big Fox show back in the days when Fox seemed to be important. And he was one of many extremely conservative critics of President Obama, whose reaction to his first election was not unlike what Robbie described in that email you got from the Christian Coalition. So I used to say to people, just imagine you're turning on the television at night and hearing Glenn Beck tell you that Barack Obama is an alien of some kind, he's not really an American, and he's hijacked this country, and he's either a socialist or a fascist, you choose. So I would say, imagine this. If you're a white person born in 1940, and let's change it to 1942, because that's when your postcard is. You were 12 years old when the Brown decision, right, the ruling came. Brown won. Brown 2 came the next year from the Supreme Court. So you have an active memory of an officially segregated America. You were 17 years old when Hawaii became the 50th state. So, in your mind, who cares whether he's born in Kenya or someplace else? We know he's not from, remember the one other candidate on the ticket in 2008 who was not from, as she called it, the lower 48? Was Sarah Palin, right? She came from the new white state, and he came from the new non-white state, right? They both were in our public politics at the same moment. You would have been 18 years old when or actually you might have just turned 19, when a revered American president, accepted by almost everyone in either party now as a hero and martyr, John F. Kennedy, said, we're in a twilight struggle against the forces of evil, meaning the Soviet Union. So some guy gets on television and tells you the new black guy from Hawaii is on the other side. It doesn't sound so strange to you. And I think what's great about Robbie's book is he takes you inside that world. It's not to say this is the enemy. No, these are our fellow citizens, and some may be here this evening. In fact, it would be great if some are. So, with that elaborate preamble, my question to you from the very first, that image you showed us, who are the enemies the Christian Coalition is talking about? Who specifically do they mean? Do you know? Do we know?
Yeah. Well, what's striking about it is this language of, which we heard, seemed to come out of left field a little bit, but this language of like chaos versus order, right? That we sort of heard, and then Trump saying, "I am the law and order candidate. I am your voice." That kind of distinction between chaos and order, and I think that the enemies are the people who are tearing down a kind of order. So I'm not sure I have like a name, but I mean, so, and that order includes, I think, for many, a world where racial minorities knew their place, where women knew their place, right? There was an ordered hierarchical world where people sort of fit in certain places, right? And I think it's the sort of breaking down of those kinds of social roles, expectations, and limitations that feels, I just watched the new Norman Lear documentary. I don't know if you had a chance to see it yet, but it talks about All in the Family and Archie Bunker and All in the Family, right? And that opening song, right? Those were the days, right? And you can hear Edith and her high notes in your head right now. But I think it's that sense, right? And one line that sticks out there, and you knew who you were then, right? Girls were girls and men were men, right? That's the line out of that thing that really sticks out. And I think it is this, this sense that, men can marry men and women can marry women, and a woman can be president or an African American can be president. Like, what does that mean for this ordered social world? And I think it means the end of that ordered social world.
Let's get to, I think, one of the really brilliant things Robbie does in the book. He does it in an understated way. He does it narratively, just as he said, don't worry, you're not reading a book that's all numbers. What he's doing is taking the numbers, just as he did here, and telling you a story based on them. Is you have a chapter on racial attitudes in the South, including among evangelicals, because I've been doing a lot of digging around in this for a book I'm now writing, a biography of Bill Buckley, who was actually a Southerner, though people don't realize this. They know that he came from this old family in Connecticut. It was not an old family. It was a new family from the South. And half the year, his family lived in Camden, South Carolina, if anybody's been there. It's about an hour away from Columbia, the capital. It's the South. It's the deep South. And a lot of the attitudes that he had and that conservatives associated with National Review, the great magazine he started, were identical, were the old views of race. And what Robbie does in his book, and I want to ask you about, is without pushing the point too much, you make the reader see a parallel between those attitudes and today's attitudes, often among conservatives and often among religious conservatives, about same-sex marriage. And what's the parallel there?
Well, on the issue of race, I think Ichétion, I was having a conversation with him at Brookings, and he asked me, like, what's one of the things that stayed with you? I think it is the enduring power of racial divides in the country that stayed with me after writing this book. And I think that, particularly, I'm thinking about the question that has really divided the conventions, right? This question of police, the tensions between police and African Americans in the country, right? So is the problem the killing of unarmed African Americans by the police, or is the problem the ambushing and murder of police in the streets, right? Well, they're obviously both problems. But the question is, like, where's the accent put and what can't be said where, right? I think is part of what breaks down. And so we actually asked a question about this and trying to kind of sort out white attitudes on this question. So the question is, do you think the killing of African American men by police are isolated incidents, or do you think they are part of a broader pattern of how police treat African Americans, right? That's the survey question. What we find is about 8 in 10 African Americans say they are absolutely part of the pattern of how police treat African Americans. That's where 8 in 10 African Americans are. Whites overall are about half as likely to agree with that statement. Only about 4 in 10 whites overall say that they are part of a broader pattern. But when you look at white evangelical Protestants, it is only 29% of white evangelical Protestants who say it's part of a pattern. For 2 to 1, right? They say that it is. These are isolated incidents. And so what this means, I think, is that it's not just that we on these issues are disagreeing about what to do about a problem, right? In this case, the cultural worldviews are so divided that there's not even agreement about what the problem is. And I think that starkness, I think, is one of the real things that we're wrestling with as a country, and is why you hear, on the one hand, some people can only say Blue Lives Matter, and some people can only say Black Lives Matter, and having a conversation about the two of these things together is, I think, difficult.
Robbie, very quickly, because this question comes up a lot in just normal conversation with normal people, what exactly is the difference between an evangelical and a mainline Protestant?
That's a great question. Am I not? Sorry about that.
That's excellent. He did that to you because it's actually me.
Yeah. Oh, look at that. I'm on now.
Somebody else breaks a glass or spills a glass at the dinner table. I'm the guy who says yes because I know it wasn't me who did it. So what is the difference? Is it a technical difference?
I talk about these two groups in the country as two branches of the kind of white Protestant family tree, essentially. And there's a couple of different ways of understanding them. The kind of mainline Protestant world typically was, got the main line from the very idea of the kind of mainline railway up here. And it was heavily concentrated in the Northeast. Tended to be, the examples are like the Episcopalian Church, the United Church of Christ, the Presbyterian Church USA. These are the kind of older, they tend to be historically more highly educated, concentrated in the Northeast, and more liberal politically. So these were the churches that were active in the civil rights movement. For example, the Christian Century, their flagship magazine, was the first place to publish Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. They had Martin Luther King on the editorial board of the Christian Century. On the other side of the divide are, in fact, sort of my people, where I come from. I'm from Mississippi. I grew up Southern Baptist, went to Southern Baptist Seminary. And these are kind of evangelicals who tend to be born again, identify as born again evangelicals.
That's commonly, when we think of an evangelical, we think of someone who's born again.
Yeah, born again. They tend to be more in the South and the Midwest. And in political science circles, the real divide is whether someone self-identifies as a born-again or evangelical Christian or not. I think that's the sort of divider. We actually ask a
The Rockefellers
self-identification
were Baptists,
questions.
which people don't always know. They were Northern Baptists.
Yes, Northern, but they were on the mainline side, right, side of this divide. Yeah.
So it really is then a cultural difference. It's not a difference of doctrine or denomination.
No, I mean,
so much.
there is these doctrinal differences, much more emphasis on individual salvation, for example, among the kind of Southern Baptist or evangelical world than there is among the mainline Protestant world.
Now, so let me ask you some other basic questions that I bet people are wondering about. How do you do the surveys and polls, and how do you know they're accurate? I mean, do you devise the questions? Do you have professional pollsters? How does all that work?
Yeah, so I'm the CEO at PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute, and we were founded in 2009. We're a nonpartisan independent research organization, and so we're a full-service polling organization. So we write our own questions, we supervise the fielding of the surveys, and we, do our best to adhere to all the sort of top shelf standards of public opinion polling. I think the one thing that sets us, that sort of we have adhered to from the beginning is making sure that we only do like random probability samples that can be generalized to the wider population. We typically do large sample sizes.
What's large? What would be a lot of
so your typical political poll would have like 1,000. So from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, they have like 1,000 people in it. Our last survey that we did with the Brookings Institution had 2,500 in it, for example.
And are they telephone polls?
A little of each. We're following the polling industry. As many of you know, one of the challenges is with fewer people having landlines, telephone polling, as it's traditionally been done, has been a bit challenging. We're currently doing 60% cell phone and 40% landline in our telephone samples, and that's really necessary in order to get accurate samples of African Americans, Latinos, and young people.
And online polling, you don't? Surveys you don't
we do, but only
Stop.
through random probability sampling. So we when we're doing an online poll, we do that through the University of Chicago's National Opinion Research Center. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you a question that has come up repeatedly during the election, and one of the few actually kind of attractive or appealing jokes Donald Trump made in his Hunger Games acceptance speech the other night was when he said, "The evangelicals love me, and I probably don't deserve it." Yeah. Why do they love him? What are they loving about him?
So I think this is, in many ways, like the head scratcher of the election, right? Is sort of why have these self-identified values voters, right, rallied around Donald Trump? I mean, the latest polling that we have shows 8 in 10. And head-to-head with Hillary Clinton, 8 in 10 white evangelical Protestants are going to vote for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton.
He ran even with Ted Cruz in Mississippi, and Cruz's entire election was based, starting with the announcement he made. You may or may not remember. If you think Cruz has been around forever, it's because it's true. He was the very first one to declare in either party. He did it at Liberty University, and he made an explicitly, I think it was in March of 2015, explicit appeal to values, evangelical voters, and Donald Trump equaled or surpassed him in state after state.
Well, particularly Super Tuesday was supposed to be Ted Cruz's firewall against Donald Trump, right? It turned out to be like his complete downfall, where Trump swept all the southern states. And in the southern states, it's important to remember, like states like South Carolina and Mississippi, in the GOP primaries, we're talking about 7 in 10 GOP primary voters are white evangelical Protestants. They're very homogeneous primaries. And again, Ted Cruz should have done better by a lot of measures there, and he didn't. Here's what I think is going on. So I wrote a piece a few weeks ago, an op-ed in the New York Times, where I argued based on data from the book. And I should say that Donald Trump's name appears nowhere in the book. The book was kind of wrapped before Trump's candidacy really took off. But I think it sheds a lot of light on what's going on. And what I argue in the book is that Trump has, not in the book, but in the op-ed, is that Trump has essentially converted these self-described values voters into what I'm calling nostalgia voters, right? And so what became more important, and there's a couple of kind of keys to this that I think people at the time didn't really pick up on, but back in January in Iowa, right, at the very beginning of the primary process, Trump gave a speech in Evangelical College where he made this very explicit claim, and he said, look, if I'm elected, I will restore power to the Christian churches. I'm the guy you need. You don't need anybody else. And when I'm president, we're going to be saying Merry Christmas in this country. No more of this Happy Holidays nonsense, right? And I think that was this very explicit message, again, hearkening back to this world that I think many white evangelical Protestants feel, in particular, feel has either completely slipped away or is certainly just right at their fingertips about to be lost. And I think it's that appeal, not an appeal. So, you think about kind of Ted Cruz was talking about these kind of bathroom bills. He kind of showed up in Indiana with this religious freedom law stood by Mike Pence. It wasn't Trump doing that. It was Cruz doing that when Pence was in trouble.
That was his last stand was on that issue.
Yeah, when Pence was in trouble in Indiana. But at the end of the day, what it seems to me is that Cruz was kind of making an argument that he was going to carve out some exemptions from the new realities, right? But Trump was saying, I'm going to turn back the clock. Right? No more of this kind of, we're not going to ask for some exemptions. We're going to change the reality. And I think it was that stronger appeal from Trump that really did, carry the day for him.
And I think that's a brilliant point, and it comes right out of Robbie's book too. Even though Trump isn't in it, you get it. And this is what comes through, and what we're kind of circling around, is the relation, these two different forces, religion and politics. And we know they go back to the founding of the country. We have debates about them still, how religious a country this was supposed to be or not. At what point did the relationship between religion and politics among evangelicals or conservatives, say with someone like Jerry Falwell, right? Back in the 1960s, he was extremely critical of Martin Luther King. And the idea through the election, I believe, of Jimmy Carter was that if you were an evangelical, you didn't mess in politics at all. That was a sinful, tainted world. Well, gee, they were right about that one. Okay, but then it changes into this other thing. When does that happen, and how does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, Jerry Falwell Sr., right, is the pivotal figure here, I think, really. I mean, he gave, in the 60s, in response to a call for ministers to join the civil rights movement, this famous speech where he basically said, look, we're about saving souls, we're not about civil rights, right? That's what preachers should be preaching about, individual salvation from the pulpit, not about marching in the streets. That's not what preachers should be doing. But he then shifted his tune by the time he got into the Carter administration. And I think it was one of the catalyzing, kind of little known, but catalyzing events was actually at Bob Jones University, this prominent who had a rule against interracial dating, and it was the Carter administration that said you're going to lose your federal tax exemption if you don't change this policy.
Discriminatory.
Yeah, because it's discriminatory. And that was actually quite an important rallying point for many evangelicals to get active in politics to kind of resist, again, this kind of federal interventionism into kind of local politics. So it was this kind of defensive, offensive, if you will, as Nathan Glazer, sociologist, described it aptly, that really brought them back in the 70s and the 80s. But I think what we're seeing now, the different thing we're seeing now, though, is this, that in the 80s and the 90s, right, the frame that was used was the moral majority. This was kind of Falwell's language, right? And there was a kernel of truth to that, right? If you thought about, so where was the country on gay rights? It wasn't that far from what Falwell was preaching, right? One man, one woman marriage. That's kind of what mainstream America thought at the time. One, I think, new thing with this where we are today is that this different is that white evangelicals, I think, are no longer under the illusion that the rest of the country agrees with them, right? And that has really changed the posture. It's changed the calculus. And I think it's changed the kind of level of anxiety and worry among that group. That it's not just that the rest of the country is kind of going to hell, but it's like we are like the lone outpost now.
Just to clarify, Robbie, is that your interpretation of data, or are you asking very specific, pointed questions that get to that?
Yeah, I mean,
what are some of the questions?
Yeah, so I mean, one that gets at this, that again, kind of think about white evangelicals is who we've been talking about mostly here as this kind of last wing of white Christian America that's experienced this decline in their own membership and influence. When we ask white evangelical Protestants, for example, questions about their own place vis-a-vis others, we asked, for example, do you think that discrimination, this kind of so-called reverse discrimination question, I think is a good bellwether. Do you think discrimination against whites is as big a problem as discrimination against blacks and other minorities. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants agree with that statement. If you ask, do you think discrimination against Christians is as big a problem as discrimination against other groups in the country, 8 in 10 white evangelicals agree with that statement, right? So this real sense of being outliers and in conflict with the rest of the culture in real terms, I think, is really driving a lot of what we see today.
And do they identify, or can you infer where they're feeling or seeing that discrimination? Obviously, there's no official legal discrimination. So where are they seeing it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of it is around gay rights, right? We have a whole chapter on gay rights in the book and how this plays out. I think the reason why Ted Cruz was so quick to go to Indiana and to kind of stand on this kind of religious exemptions bill was precisely because it is a way, I think, of trying to kind of win a few battles on a field where you've essentially lost, right? As a kind of way of kind of carving out continued places. And I think it's that sense of like our values are no longer shared, right, by the wider society. That's a real place of conflict.
Well, and in fact, it was damaging to Mike Pence when he waffled on the bill in Indiana because they were going to get in trouble with Walmart, which is a bigger employer. And I suppose that's where they're feeling the culture shift too. Right. That leads me to a couple of points. One I want to ask you about is this sense that the pressure isn't really coming from elected officials so much, or certainly not law enforcement. It's really coming from the culture, isn't it? You turn on the television, you go to a movie. Can I take my child to see a movie here that's going to have violence, and more specifically, sex, and maybe even interracial or gay sex or something like that? It's in the music, it's in the books, and if you go online, it's all over the place. The sense of cultural embattlement. And how does that get translated? Seems to me something Trump has been very effective at is the political correctness argument. It's not so much that you are discriminated against as that you're not allowed to say what you really think. Or if you do, someone's going to stomp on you. The New York Times editorial board is going to ridicule you if you don't go along with the crowd. Is it that kind of thing they're feeling? Or
I mean, one of the things that I think has broken down and that I think has caused a great deal of anxiety is that, so I was in a conversation with, on the radio the other day with Bob Vander Plaats, who's a sort of activist in Iowa, a white evangelical Protestant activist in Iowa. And anyways, I have a lot of respect for him, but he kept evoking, I think at 3 different times in the conversation, he said, it's just common sense that, right? And they would go off and say something that is in fact only shared by white evangelical Protestants.
What's an
right?
example of that?
Right. So I mean that a child should have a mother and a father in the home, right? It's just common sense that this should be the case. And I think one of the real kind of a sense of vertigo that's happened is that, and why the term political correctness has come under such attack is because these assumptions can't just be brought forward without being challenged anymore, right? And this whole sense, and if you think about the kind of security that provides in a world, in a kind of a living social world, right, where everybody shares the same set of assumptions. You can talk in shorthand. You can sort of, you don't have to feel like you've got your guard up. You can just kind of, say what you think, and that kind of everybody agrees with you. And that, those kind of insular worlds are increasingly not available, right? Or they're getting smaller, and you have to kind of check before you kind of have that conversation. But I think it's this, and that's about power, right? That's about a kind of social and cultural world that used to really hold sway in the country and that has really moved from the center to the periphery and has to renegotiate now what counts as common sense in the country.
And Robbie, would you also say the kind of thing that David Brooks has written about in his column, Ross Douthat, who I think does some really brilliant, interesting work, is that also because of social media, we go into these little cones or silos. We find the people who agree with us and who form an echo chamber, and then you become embattled in that little enclave. So yes, you can escape that broader conversation that you're uncomfortable with or is unwelcoming to you, but then you find the place where you are welcome. Yeah. And has Trump been really good at somehow creating the feeling or sensation or perception that there are really more of us out there than the liberals might think or the Democrats might say?
Well, again, we're not talking about, we're no longer using the moral majority, right? I mean, certainly still some us and them kind of constructs, but I think what's happened is, go back to that chart of the Republican Party, particularly 8 in 10, right, of their coalition are white Christians. That's a really homogeneous political coalition. So when you have that kind of homogeneity in your political coalition, you can tailor a message quite narrowly that appeals pretty deeply, right, to that world, because it really has a lot of shared assumptions, shared fears, and shared worries about where America is going, for example. And so I think that that's what's happened here is that Trump's, and I think the other thing that's been maybe masterful is that Trump has sort of addressed a cultural moment and not a set of policy kind of things. And you try to pin him down on policy, it's like nailing Jell-O to the wall. It really is really tricky. But when he says, let's make America great again, people have a sense that they know what he means. And especially when he says very explicit things like, that means I'm going to restore power to the Christian churches, by which he doesn't really mean African-American churches and Latino, Catholic, multi-ethnic parishes, right? He really does mean white Protestant churches at the end of the day.
Before we get to the questions, one more quick one for you. I think it's worth talking about. Is you've mentioned young people, we mean millennials. Millennials, you say, are less devout, or at least they're not churchgoers. But talk a little bit about how millennials are demographically and ethnically different from other population cohorts.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the most ethnically, racially diverse cohort and the largest cohort.
Do you realize that there are more millennials than any other population group in the country, including baby boomers?
Yeah, that's right. So a huge tidal wave, sort of kind of crashing on the shore here. And when we look at those groups, when we ask questions about, for example, how important it is that you raise a child religious, millennials much less likely to say that this is important. How much do you trust institutions? Millennials much less likely than older Americans to say that they trust these institutions. So it's a really different mindset. Now, this is not to say that millennials don't have sort of spiritual interest, but it is to say that the idea of institutional religion is something that they have had a real problem with growing up.
And ethnically, it's 43 or 44% of millennials identify as non-white?
Yeah, I think it's about right. Yeah.
Which is much larger than any other
group.
So we're going to questions now.
Let's give Sam and Robbie a big round of applause. My name's Simon Greer. I'm on the board of PRRI and happy to take questions. I'll try to take 2 or 3, group them together. I'll repeat them for our friends at C-SPAN who are recording, and then we'll turn it over to Robbie to answer them. So why don't we do 1, 2, 3. Go ahead.
Lisa Daughtry Weiss, Conservative Side. I'm going to try to ask this carefully. If you compare Bill Clinton's outreach, based on your slide, with Hillary's campaign, and Hillary very recently hired a faith outreach person in person. I just wondered about the effort of really reaching white Christians, given that there's still a heavy voting bloc. So obviously some Christians will not vote for Hillary because of abortion, but that is not the deciding issue for other Christians. And I just wonder if you feel like the Democrats have given up on white Christians and they shouldn't have.
Great question.
Great. Thank you, gentleman in the back.
Yes, thank you.
Hey, Ken.
Interestingly enough, it was the business community, not the political community, certainly not the religious community, but the business community that pushed back and really caused him to reverse his decision on that. So I'm just wondering, do you have any insights, data, or information on this coalition between business and progressives?
That's a great question, too. Yeah. And you're going to do one more there?
Yep.
Yeah, Ned White from the Unitarian Universalist Speech Program at Shelter Rock on Long Island. Looking a little bit longer term, there's a lot of grief and there's a lot of fear that's rampant in our culture, in fueling the sense of division. What do you see as a path forward for any entities that might wish to be either healers or bridge builders in such a polarized society?
All right.
3 very simple, easy to answer
Yeah,
questions.
right.
This is going to be great. So, Robbie, the first question was about comparing the Bill Clinton to Hillary Clinton on their outreach to white Christians. So maybe take that one first.
Okay. We're going to get 3 more questions, so I can skip these first 3. No. So, all right. So, Lisa, I'll start with yours. So, thanks for the question. So, I'm not sure I can do a kind of fine-grained comparison of the two, but the bigger question about whether what should Democrats do, right, as a political party about reaching white Christians? So, it's important to sort of, I've been talking about kind of white Christians, but it's important to remember there are white Catholics, there are white non-denominational Christians, there are white mainline Protestant Christians, there are white evangelical Christians. Now, if you're thinking pure tactics, white evangelicals have voted in the last 4 election cycles 8 in 10 for Republican presidential candidates, right? So if you want to do a deep dive and really, uphill slog, that would be the way to go. But mainline Protestants have been leaning Republican, but not so strongly, right? Same is true for white Catholics, have been leaning Republican, but not so strongly. So, I mean, there, I think, are real opportunities in those two groups, I think, to sort of think about, things like that are because those two groups are also in the Midwest. So, I mean, one of the places if you think about, like, where white working class, that Barack Obama did better among white working class voters was really in the Midwest, outside the South, and particularly around kind of basic issues like the auto bailout. Right, was kind of a big deal for kind of white Christians in the South that were kind of working class. So I think that's a good opportunity. It's also important to remember that, yes, there is this decline, but white Christians still make up 45% of the country. That's still nearly half, and they still are in a majority in the electorate.
Okay, I'd like to add something very quickly. Yeah. If you saw today in the upshot in the New York Times, it said it's not inconceivable that Donald Trump could build a majority with the conservative white male vote. Yeah. Really the people you're talking about.
And so, Robbie, just to push the point, do you think the Clinton campaign is underinvesting in outreach to this subset of white Christians who could be base voters?
Yeah, that I don't think I've got an opinion on.
Right. Yeah. I was just trying to help you out. The next question was about the business and progressive sort of coalition around things like the religious freedom bill. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yes. So what was interesting about Nathan Deal in Georgia, right, is that so yes, he got absolutely may not have done what he did without the business influence. But what was also interesting about him is what he said about why he did it, right? And in public, what he basically said is he himself is evangelical, and he said it's my own Christian faith that tells me that we don't need this kind of bill in Georgia, and got a lot of flack from that. So I think it's kind of an exceptional, interesting point.
How did he unpack?
I'm having trouble kind of remembering exactly how he parsed it, but he did sort of go back to kind of separation of church and state kind of ideas, that this was part of his Christian faith as well, and that we basically didn't need the law to kind of uphold those kinds of separations. But I actually end the book with talking about this influence of business, right, and that one of the things that when you see that you can, you're at a kind of cultural moment when, for example, the Grammy Awards broadcast in primetime TV the marriage of a number of same-sex couples, took a break from the Grammy Awards, came out and did this ceremony in primetime on CBS, which had been a little behind the curve on having like gay characters on shows and things like that. And there was really not that much backlash. And this was like Queen Latifah was like presiding over this thing. And then in the middle of this song by Macklemore and Lewis that was really taking the church to task for its kind of for anti-gay teachings that some churches had brought in. It was a kind of a remarkable cultural moment, and there really wasn't that big of a backlash. I mean, 10 years ago, there would have been people boycotting CBS for months over something like this. And then just like companies like Honey Maid, Cheerios, and Chevrolet, who are now having kind of, multi-ethnic gay couples on their kind of commercials, that is a sign that things have kind of moved. Yeah.
Thanks. And then the third question was about the grief and the fear and the sense of division and decline, and any tips about a path forward.
Yeah. Next book. No, I don't know. I do try to kind of gesture towards some things, and it is hard. I mean, I spent some time trying to think about so what are the institutions that we have that might help us bridge this divide? And I couldn't really come up with any that would be that helpful, right? Because I thought, oh, well, maybe churches could, so we have like more churches than post offices in the U.S., right? So they're everywhere. So maybe that's the thing. But, when I looked at that, I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. was famous for saying that 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the country. That is largely still true today. About 8 in 10 churches are essentially monoracial churches. So there's not a lot of cross-fertilization going on there. And, I couldn't really come up with a lot of the gains that we had from Brown that you brought up before, desegregating public schools, have been lost over the last 10 to 15 years. So that's not really a place where this is happening at significant levels. But here's the challenge before us, though. I think if I could put it in succinctly, I think, the challenge is we have kind of these two different, I mean, we were joking before, and I've heard people joke that, like, oh, if you were an alien from Mars and you just watched the Republican convention, then you watched the Democratic convention, you would think they were different countries, right? That they were kind of campaigning for. And there's some real truth to that, I think. And so I think the challenge before us is how do we tell a story of kind of a changing America where this kind of waspy center can no longer be assumed, but that still has a place for those people who used to be in the center, right? So it makes room for the kind of great diversity that we have before us, but at the same time doesn't exclude the people who have been in power, but still has a place for it. Because I think that's the real challenge, is that for many white evangelical Protestants, they look at the country they see before them and they don't see themselves in it. And I think that's part of the biggest problem going forward.
I want to follow up with a brief question that builds on it, this last, which is that in the book you do, in that very subtle and humane way of yours, say maybe there is room for, let's just call them progressive Americans, to give a little more at this point when the cultural battles have been won. And I know this is an argument that Ross Douthat has also made in the Times. So the battle is lost, from that side. We know that it's over, it's finished. Can't you be a little kinder and more generous in victory? And you have a few remarks about that too. So why don't you say something on that?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of evoke Reconstruction right after the Civil War. I mean, one of the biggest battles that President Lincoln had to deal with was, we've got these vanquished foes, like, what do we do with them, right? Do we punish them? Do we disenfranchise them? Like, what do we do? And Lincoln's stance was, we've got to find a way to build the country back to one country again. And if we go stripping them of voting rights and we, do all these punitive things, that's going to be really hard to do. I'm not sure exactly what the kind of current analogs are, but I do think there is some space here to, I'm not sort of arguing in the book that, you roll back the kind of legal victories or roll back, the cultural victories. But there's a way in which I think there might be a kind of more openness, less kind of looking down the nose and less kind of derision that I think might help the kind of those people who find themselves kind of isolated now do this thing that I was talking about, try to find a place where they still see themselves as part of something bigger and not just the sort of vanquished foe at the end of the day.
I seem to remember that Andrew Sullivan, who was really one of the great pioneers in the same-sex marriage debate, was much more sympathetic to the religious liberty argument than you would expect. Because the idea is not that everybody has to agree with you. It's just that you shouldn't discriminate against the others. Let us, Andrew and others, live the way we want, but it doesn't mean that it has to be a uniform or universal standard.
So let's go back to the audience for 3 easier questions. 1, 2, and 3. Go ahead.
Mr. Jones, I too was raised a Southern Baptist, but I spent the last 22 years abroad and just come back to the U.S. And I have the feeling that I'm kind of living in the bottle city of Candor, and this country and the whole discussion has been about issues that have to be sorted out among Americans. And how will this transformation of the U.S. That you talk about affect our foreign policy? Because as you said in the beginning, the country was founded on Christian values, Christian ethics, and in many ways you've actually stated something that has kind of been verboten to say, but that basically that it's a Christian country. And so now that's changing, but how does that affect the way we engage with the world? Because until recently, our view has been very expansionist, very very much involved in the world as American exceptionalists. And I wonder if this will change.
Great, thank you.
Good question.
You addressed already a little bit the issue of sampling, but I'm grasping at straws a little bit and hoping maybe there's a little distortion in your sample, and that I would just intuitively think that the more progressive someone is, in other words, the more urban, the younger, the less religious, the more likely they are to skew a sample that they're not, if they're being polled, they're more likely to not answer the phone or be skeptical about sharing something of urban, sophisticates are not going to tell you their demographics or what they feel. So is there a chance, I'm hoping, is there a chance that the sampling by nature is forcing you into a somewhat more traditional conservative sample?
Great, thank you. And the third.
My question is about the millennial. Since we already understand that our traditional church is an Asian population. So in the polling or any of your research, did you find a skew for the millennial, whether they tend to be evangelical or fundamental or more progressive? And in that, more people going to seminary, more seminaries creating. So did you see a skew of progressive or conservative?
Okay.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So first question, Robbie, was about foreign policy and the impacts of all of this on America's stance in the world.
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that, I would maybe sharpen up the conception a little bit, because I think it's important that, so the country was founded, not as a Christian nation, but as a nation that explicitly had freedom of religion, right? But that's an easy thing to do when you have a de facto white Protestant majority, right? So when you're in a very culturally secure spot, it's a much easier thing to say, oh yeah, we're going to have freedom of religion, we're going to have non-establishment, but at the same time, you look at Congress, you look at the presidents, you look at the Supreme Court, they're stacked with white Protestants, right? We kind of know, okay, well, we can hold this together, even though in principle. And so one of the things that I think is happening is that we're actually, for the first time, really being tested about what we really think about the First Amendment, right? And whether we really think religious liberty in its sort of full free exercise sense is something, and non-establishment is something that we really want as a country. And because I think is for the first time with this kind of white Protestant minority still has to stand up for that view, even when they're no longer the kind of cultural majority. So I think that's kind of one of the important moments that we're at in terms of kind of how we understand the place of religion in public life. It's also the case that in our most recent survey, just out of the field, for the first time ever, we recorded white evangelical Protestants no longer saying that the country is a Christian nation. So that's new. So they're now saying, they used to sort of be a slight majority saying the country is founded as a Christian nation, still is a Christian nation. Now they're saying the second option in the battery is it used to be a Christian nation, but it is no longer. And that's where white evangelicals are now. That's new on the scene. I think it's a recognition of these shifts. On the foreign policy thing, I think it's a little bit maybe complicated, kind of where we're going to go for, because I do think this kind of, when it was communism in Russia was the big threat, right, in the 1950s. That, by the way, is where we get under God in the pledge, right, is when we were differentiating ourselves from the so-called godless communists, right? No, we're the Christian nation, they're the communist nation, and we kind of put this kind of in our pledge as a response to that. I don't know that we're going to, that kind of thing is going to drive kind of foreign policy going forward, just because I think that sense is not there in the same way that it was in the 1950s.
Yeah, I'd like to just toss in a few things there about the foreign policy. The point Robbie just made about the Cold War and religion, that was also a very fraught argument, even at the height of the Cold War. The argument, for instance, if you go back and look at the coverage of the Little Rock integration, the argument that some of the most conservative Republicans in Congress made was, we embarrass ourselves in front of the world and lose the ideological battle against the Soviets if we're not letting small children enter a school, then how do we present ourselves as moral opposition to them. Do you know what the answer to that was in National Review magazine? That's not our problem. The real slaves are behind the Iron Curtain. So who cares? We don't have to improve our domestic relations to please communists or impress people whose hearts and minds are on the other side. In other words, there have always been really fraught arguments on the right. And the second I'd add to American exceptionalism is that's really the obverse of something that was much more dominant in our politics, which was unilateralism, and before that, non-interventionism/isolationism. Term unilateralism was invented as a joke by Arthur Schlesinger and Richard Rovere in 1951. This idea that America would actually act alone, that's what got turned into the American exceptionalism of another era. So that's also involved in a very particular kind of foreign policy that climaxed or plummeted under George W. Bush and the Iraq War. So that got taken off the table in many ways. Another thing I want to ask you about the healing question, Robbie, is can't one make the argument from the right, will be kind of devil's advocate, that if liberals are going to be great supporters of tolerance and diversity and change, why can't they be more tolerant and diverse of people who differ with them ideologically? Isn't that the argument where conservatives still have a case to make?
Well, I mean, it depends, right? Because the whole idea of is whether we're talking about principles or just like tolerance of everything, right? That's never really been the argument. So, I mean, Russell Moore at the Southern Baptist Convention, I think, is one of the more interesting figures who's trying to kind of figure this out. I talk about him in the book, who is really trying to accept their kind of decentered place in the world. And as you saw that chart of Southern Baptist growth rates from the 1950s, right, sort of 9 straight years of decline. And he's trying to sort of like think about like, okay, what does it mean then to be a countercultural church, right? But I think in some ways he's caught in the same conundrum that if you're going to be countercultural, that depends on you always having a negative a value of what the culture is that you're just going to react against. It's kind of a weird circle. So I'm hoping that like one of the things he can do is like think about what are the principles we're going to stand on, right? Not just sort of like react to we're going to be tolerant of everything. No, we're not going to be tolerant of everything, obviously, right? There are principles behind tolerance that place a limit on what we're going to be tolerant of. And so I think those maybe we'll actually get to those discussions, which I think would be a really healthy thing to do. So what does it mean to be tolerant? What does it mean to be a kind of countercultural maybe check on power? But I think it's going to have to get back to some more fundamental questions about what are we really for? What are we really against?
How come there are no, there's not a single Protestant on the Supreme Court? Everybody know that? Why is that? Why would that be? How would we get there?
Yeah, it's remarkable, really. So in the entire history of the Supreme Court until 2010 was the first year that we lost our last Protestant on the Supreme Court. And if Merrick Garland is waiting in the wings, if he ever gets a vote, and gets confirmed, then it will be only Catholics and Jews on the Supreme Court sitting right now.
I know we've only got a few more minutes, and I want to go to the second question, which I would summarize this way, which is, I'm hoping you're not that good at this, and you're actually wrong.
Thanks for that summary. So I think the best thing to say is that, if the data in the book is wrong, all public polling in the country is wrong, right?
Well, we've seen a little bit of that.
Certainly, I mean, there is some of that, but one of the things we've really tried to do, I mean, we're talking very large sample sizes. Some of the data, the demographic data that I'm tracking involves 80,000 interviews a year. Right, so this is a very, very large, like almost unprecedented data set that we're looking at, and we're doing all the kind of methodological rigor that you can do to get the best sample you can. Now, does that mean you are fully getting every person you get? There's always what you're talking about is non-response bias, right? So people who don't. Who you call, but you can never really get to pick up the phone. Every survey certainly has that. The way that that's compensated for at the end of the day is that, so even if you start out with a very perfectly balanced, a beautiful, perfectly balanced sample, by the time you get done with your contacting, no matter how many times you contact people, however good you are, the responses you get back are always a little bit skewed. Right? And so the way that gets handled in public opinion polling is that those then are reweighted to match the demographic characteristics of the country. So that if you are one of those rare individuals, and like one of the rarest, so if you are a white woman in your 70s, you're very easy to get on the phone. Right? And you might be hard to get off the phone once we get you. But so that person actually at the end of the day might get weighted 0.8 of a response, right? But if you are a 21-year-old Latino male, you are very hard to get on the phone. You definitely gonna have to get you on the cell phone, and that's hard to do. Even getting you to complete the interview is tough to do. And once we get a completed interview, you might get weighted like twice, right? You may count it as 2 respondents to make up for that other person.
So they're right. They are discriminated against.
But at any rate, so the sample is rebalanced. The short answer is the sample is rebalanced to kind of match the demographic characteristics. That's what all kind of credible polls do. Yeah.
Third question was about millennials. Maybe you could just say another quick word about their religiosity, their progressivism, and anything about seminaries or how they're engaging religiously.
Yeah, I have less data on the seminary question, but clearly they're a different breed in terms of their religiosity. So if you look at the white evangelical question, for example, that's the most conservative kind of wing of kind of the Protestant, white Protestant world. If you look at seniors, white evangelicals constitute about 3 in 10 seniors. They only constitute 1 in 10 millennials, right? And then we got this 1/3 of them that are religiously unaffiliated at all. So that really just changed the composition of the group. And then just all the other things, like they're all kinds of kind of culture, they rub shoulders with people of different races and ethnicities from the moment they're born, most of them. They're around people who speak different languages. They know gay friends from the moment they know what that is.
And that's the big issue for them, right?
Yeah, it is. It becomes a huge issue. More than 3/4 of the millennial generation supports same-sex marriage, for example. The one thing I can say about seminaries, though, is that the places where seminaries are actually growing, and Catherine Henderson is here from Auburn, who tracks a lot of this stuff, right, is a couple of places. It's multi-ethnic seminaries, Latino seminaries, African-American seminaries, and there is this kind of newer kind of multi-faith movement that is kind of gaining some traction, even some more traditional seminaries. That's also kind of a sign of the times.
Robbie, is it true that the white millennial males, white guys 30 and under, voted for Romney over Obama?
Oh,
I think Pew had that.
Yeah, that may be right. I mean, one of the things we have seen is that white working class males in the millennial generation have been hit pretty hard by the recession. And so even if they're college educated, they're having trouble getting a job. Their economic situation is not that great. A lot of them have to move back in with their parents. I mean, and they actually are in a lot of distress. And we see that coming out as well, even though they're part of this generation. White millennial men who are working class have, I think just below the surface, this racial resentment factor is still alive, even with that group in the younger generation. Yeah.
2 last quick questions, 1 and 2. Go ahead. Yep.
Typically during discussion, presentation of book, after a writer will be asked about their future plan. So my question is, if you're going to write a book, death or end of Judaism in America, because it's even more obvious than with Christianity, with mixed marriage, and with 25% have no affiliation, no interest in Judaism, and Reform and conservative movements that choose only a name. And another book you're also going to write, I hope, maybe death or end of Western civilization in general.
Stay tuned for the sequel.
Yeah.
Your question, sir?
Yes, my question goes back to a little bit the religious freedom question, not so much in the Georgia situation, but the Mississippi situation. And in Mississippi, they took the freedom of religion question and they turned it into a 14th Amendment question about equal protection. And it strikes me that in light of much of what you argue in the book, that shift, it also connects to the Russell Moore question, that shift toward what does pluralism look like moves us from First Amendment freedom of expression questions to 14th Amendment kind of equal coverage under the law question.
I'm going to summarize the first one as the end of a lot of things. And what's your next book?
No, so I should do the kind of Tim LaHaye Left Behind series. That's inside joke for all you evangelicals in the crowd. The thing I'm thinking about next actually is what now, really, and because I think the reason why this is important in the way that it may be less important is because this kind of white Protestant culture really did hold the center in America for most of our life, right, as a nation. And that's why I think it's fading from the scene. I mean, I begin the book with an obituary, right, for white Christian America. And I end the book with a eulogy, trying to kind of think about what to say over the remains that we're seeing right now. I think that's what's really important. I think the next question, it's a big, huge question. It is the question. I certainly won't have the answer for it. But I think the question we're struggling with is what now, right? If we no longer have this one kind of cultural center thing, for better or for worse, and I think it was both, some of both, holding kind of sway in the center and kind of serving as a hub from which other things were connected, what then? Right? How do we talk about being American? How do we talk about being a nation? What is the kind of narrative that we're going to kind of weave out of the messy remains that are sitting before us?
And Robbie, how much of this is a problem of there not being those sort of mediating institutions? Yuval Levin, who's a very bright guy, he's a Washington think tank guy involved with the Ethics and Public Policy Institute, and he has also edits a magazine, National Affairs. He has a book that I'm going to be writing about called The Fractured Republic. And his argument is we're caught between individualism on the one hand, extreme rights, I get to do whatever I want, and a sort of reliance on the huge central state, and there's nothing in between. And what you've kind of suggested is that those in-between institutions just aren't that strong anymore. He wants them to be, but maybe they're not really. Yeah. Is that the problem?
I mean, I think it's certainly one of the problems, and because I think the institutions that are there aren't helping us unsort ourselves, right? I mean, into these kind of silos. And so I think that's the biggest challenge, is trying to figure out where these points of intersection might be, and that we need institutions to do that. It's also going to mean that I think probably conservatives are going to have to think a little bit more about individual rights, and liberals are going to think a little bit more about character and kind of these mediating institutions. I think hopefully some of that will happen.
Robbie, the last question was about Mississippi, religious freedom, pluralism, and First and 14th Amendments. I don't know if you want to jump in on any of that.
Yeah, so Mississippi, my home state, followed that pretty well. I mean, the Mississippi law is like a little bizarre because it was so broad. I mean, if anybody's it really went beyond what most of the kind of RFRA religious freedom laws went, and spelled out. Like, for example, if you disagreed with a single parent raising a child on their own, you could actually discriminate under Mississippi's law. That's how broadly it was written. So it wasn't just about gay and lesbian couples. It was really about a man, a woman as the nuclear family. That kind of, and anything outside of that actually fell under protection of this law, that you could discriminate on the basis of it. So it was kind of a little bizarre because of that. But I agree with you that the conversation that we're going to have really is about, and we were saying, so how much space is there for dissent, and what does dissent look like? Right, is one of the big, for the losers in particular of these kind of big cultural and legal battles. What is okay? What flies in the face of the law, and what is really a kind of accommodation that seems respectful of a group that disagrees? I mean, so we have some agreement already on hand. I think it's that, for example, liberals and conservatives both agree generally that pastors speaking from the pulpit aren't going to be brought up on charges of hate speech, right, for preaching the beliefs of their church, right? That's a First Amendment already protected right. Now, that I think many evangelicals think that's not protected, and I think that's part of the challenge. But so I think one place for people who believe in civil liberties to kind of reinforce, to say, absolutely, we are absolutely protecting those rights inside of those churches. Now, when we get to hiring people, we're on a different landscape. But I think sketching that out is going to be, a decade-long project. Yeah.
Great. So everybody received a book when you came in. We have friends here from Simon & Schuster who published the book. There are more books. And what you can do is you can figure out how to get a book to a friend. So that's your one task to take away from tonight. Robbie's going to be outside signing books for folks who want to do that. And before we give them both a round of applause, what I wanted to say about Robbie's work is, obviously your scholarship is amazing, your thought leadership is terrific, but I think it's that in this highly polarized time, you don't disdain the people you're writing about, right? You actually have empathy for their situation, and you invite us all to try to think about what the world looks like from where they see it. So we might find bridges and might find a way to work together. So thank you for that gift to all of us.